Thank you, Galen. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen McHale, one of the priests here at Christ Episcopal Church, and I'm joined tonight by Matt Ganser, the Vice President of Business Operations for Astra, a company here in Alameda that sends rockets into space, which is the coolest thing ever. I'm pretty convinced. I have a bunch of terrible questions to start off with, Matt.
I'll probably have terrible answers, so we're good.
All right, so the first one, are you ready?
Please.
So our job at the church, of course, is to send souls into the heavens. Why are you competing with us?
I don't know. I think if history's taught us something, competing with a church is a difficult, dangerous game. So I wouldn't quite put it that way. As a person of faith, I think science and faith really inform each other. I think the more you learn about one, the more you can learn about the other. But not in my words, of course, but I think the author Frank Wright, he coined the term the overview effect to describe the collective experience of astronauts and cosmonauts and so forth and their experience hurling through space on the space shuttle or the International Space Station or whatever. And it was meant to encompass this idea of this sense of that the Earth is very fragile, that we're all very connected, and it kind of brought the idea forward that intellectually we know we're all on the same planet, but at a spiritual and emotional level, it's something very different than that. And so I think space really inspires and kind of brings out and elicits these amazing emotions and feelings that it's hard to get from our surly earthly bounds.
Wow, that was way more serious than I expected. That was pretty good. All right, baiting you further,
Sure.
How come Elon Musk has much bigger rockets?
Has to do with ego.
But your rockets are relatively...
It's dangerous to bait him because he'll find you.
Astra makes relatively modest rockets?
Our rockets are small, so our rockets are about 45 feet long. His rockets are multiple times bigger. We are taking a different approach at overlapping but slightly different market segments. Elon is trying to launch hundreds of satellites at a time, or not hundreds, but thereabouts. It's almost like a bus going to space, and then those satellites have to find their way to their final orbit. Astra is taking more of a bespoke kind of FedEx approach, where we're taking fewer satellites into the final location where we want to in space. And we think there's a different market. We think people are willing to pay at some point a little bit of a premium for that kind of service to be able to get to their final destination when they want it, where they want it. Elon's business model is a little bit different. It's also worth noting that SpaceX is, quite explicitly, they're on a really exciting and interesting mission to colonize other planets, and that is decidedly not what Astra is invested in or excited or doing. We applaud that kind of stuff. Space tourism and going to other planets is really cool, but it's not what we're doing as a company. We're really pointing our services and our efforts here on planet Earth.
All right, the last of my very serious questions. I am wearing my uniform tonight. Mm-hmm. I expected you to come in a spacesuit. Apparently, you are not an astronaut and you do something different at Astra. Is that the case?
Yeah, unfortunately. We actually had a group of young kids, including my own, that came for a kind of a warm-up tour as we were trying to work out how we want to get involved in the community. And the kids saw some upper stage engines, which they weren't impressed by. They saw some mock-ups of satellites, which they also were not impressed by. And then they saw the rocket, and they thought that was really great. And the overwhelming question from all these 5- and 6-year-olds were, well, where do the people go? And we're like, well, it's not that kind of rocket. It actually, see all these cool communication and Earth observation satellites, and their little 5- and 6-year-old brains were like, no, but where do the people go? It's like I just wasn't able to answer the question quite right.
So my takeaway is that I am asking the questions of a 5-year-old.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right. Okay, so Astra's mission is to improve life on Earth from space. Tell me about that. What does that mean?
Yeah. I think this is one of the things that is really exciting about Astra and a lot of space companies in general, is it's this chance to use this ultimate high ground that is space to do things just fundamentally differently. What unites Astra, the people that work there, and our customers is that sense of let's improve life on Earth. Space has been dominated by billion-dollar satellites. It's very government and to a large degree military heavy as well. It's always been the domain of really expensive stuff. What's really changed in the last several years is that satellites, driven largely by miniaturization of electronics like your phone, are enabling a whole new suite of satellites, and they're getting to the size of like a briefcase or even smaller, and we're talking about a few kilograms to tens of kilograms. And what that's doing is that it's getting cheaper, it's getting more possible to build applications that can, or satellites that can support applications that matter to people here on planet Earth. Astra's role in that is to make it predictable, reliable, and affordable to get all of those satellites into orbit. And to give you some sense of the scale of what we're talking about, today there's 4,000 to 5,000 satellites in orbit. Depending on which projection you want to use, there's going to be 30,000 to 50,000 satellites in orbit probably in the next 10 to 20 years. And those satellites are doing a whole host of stuff. It's communications, it's Earth observation. To kind of make that practical, Astra is launching a series of satellites for NASA called the Tropics missions over the next couple of months. And it's really exciting. I can't tell you exactly when, for SEC reasons, but it's coming, and we're really excited about it. These satellites are designed to better understand the formation of tropical cyclones, hurricanes, in order to better understand how to model them and predict when they might make landfall to create better early warning systems. Capella Space is a small satellite. Well, they're fairly large now, but they're a satellite company here in the Bay Area. You might know them if you've been reading the Wall Street Journal or New York Times. Some of their imagery is on the front page of regarding covering the conflict in Ukraine, which was so startling even for us in the space industry to see kind of a small company being able to so move and bring people into a conflict. And then there's another company called Planet that's based in San Francisco. They're really cool. What they're trying to do is image every piece of the Earth every single day, in a really high, revisit rate. And the applications from that are countless. It's deforestation, it's better understanding of agricultural patterns. There's so many cool things you can do with that amount of data. So we're really at the beginning of what that means, but as far as what improving life on Earth means, but for us it means enabling all these services that really matter to people.
Cool. All right. How come it's so hard to get them up there?
This is where I definitely wish I was actually a rocket scientist or an engineer. I used to be an engineer, and now I'm just a business guy. I can't tell you that exactly. What I can tell you is that it takes about 90% plus, actually much more than that, of the mass that's in a rocket is basically the fuel, just to get a few kilograms into space. It's incredibly energy intense to be able to get your payload up there. You have to be moving at thousands of kilometers an hour. You have to be moving incredibly quickly. All of that architecture, all of that energy is what's necessary just to get a small little thing in space. Gravity is just really tough to contend with. And so, when it comes to the rocket business, all the engineering and a lot of the really smart people are focused on how do you make that as efficient and from an energy budget as affordable as possible, because it is just so hard to get stuff into orbit.
Wow. All right. I don't know anything about this. I'm learning a lot. Okay, so you are not driving the rockets, and you're not designing the engines. What do you do?
Yeah, and to be fair, no one drives the rockets, although that would be the coolest job at the company. A bunch of computer clusters do that. So I'm business operations, which is a terrible title. Nobody knows exactly what that means. But I cover government relations, real estate, spaceports, and this regulatory thing called licensing. Think of the DMV, but much worse. That's the FAA and to some degree the FCC. So I manage those areas for the company.
What's a spaceport now? I think of Buck Rogers.
Great question. Cape Canaveral is a spaceport. So spaceports is definitely one of the funnest parts of my job, getting to think about, because you can't reach everywhere in space from everywhere on Earth. The latitude you launch from, the direction you launch from dictates where you can actually go into orbit. And so the spaceports are a pretty crucial part of that. So one thing that I get to be part of is helping come up with a strategy and the execution plan of building out the portfolio of spaceports that are going to support our customers. So think like Cape Canaveral, but think of a much, much smaller version of that. Our entire spaceport for an Astra spaceport could fit within this church. It's a few bits of concrete, that are smaller than the size of a basketball court, some power, some water, and some internet, and that's about all we need.
We are looking for tenants, actually, to supplement our budget.
Well,
so
I don't know if the FAA or how the mayor would feel about that, so let's talk about that.
all right, so this is a related question to that. I always thought you had to launch rockets as close to the equator as possible, because that's where you get a boost from the Earth's spin. But you launch on Kodiak Island, right? Some of your rockets.
Some of the rockets, yeah.
And the Earth is moving relatively more slowly up there.
That's right.
What are you doing up there?
You do know something about this.
I know way more than you think.
So you're right. If you launch near the equator, you do get a little bit of extra kick. And the cool thing about launching from the equator is you can launch in any direction, essentially. So from the equator, you can go up, you can go north, you can go due east, and everything in between. Taken to the extreme, at the North Pole, you could only launch south in every single direction. It turns out rockets don't really fly and turn. That was one of the things I learned in my first couple of weeks is, well, why don't we just steer the thing? And all the engineers and scientists looked at me like, you're on the business team, right? I'm like, yep. The reason we launch out of Kodiak is a few things. One is it's principally directed by where our customers want to go in space. So the customers that we've launched from there, they want to go into typically what are called polar or SSO orbits. Those are orbits that are kind of more just like around, up and down around the poles, these north-south sort of orbits. If we wanted to launch something, if a customer wanted to go around the equator, we would have to move down to the equator and launch from somewhere. Another reason we launched from Kodiak, Alaska, is it tends to be more affordable, and it tends to be easier than Cape Canaveral. Cape Canaveral is a big federal place. It's really amazing. I've been there a few times, and it's really impressive what they do. But it is a large federal bureaucracy. You have to deal with a lot of layers, and it tends to be very expensive. And
no bears, though.
No bears. There are bears running around Kodiak Island. And between Florida and Kodiak Island, I'd say Kodiak Island is maybe wins the cake for the beauty contest. But the affordability part is really important. I think SpaceX was really the company that broke the mold and really opening up space for more people and for more companies. Space has always been the domain of really, really expensive things, government programs and military and stuff like that, which is not a way to really rapidly grow an economy. SpaceX blew that wide open, and a lot of us are excited to follow and hopefully improve on that. So having an affordable place to launch from is a really important part of being able to really grow the space economy.
Cool. All right. Okay. Harder than launching rockets, I think, is launching children. And you have 3 of them. How, and they're little and very cute.
Yes.
How on earth do you balance a job at a startup with 3 kids and home life and all that?
Starts with my wife, first and foremost. I mean, she works, volunteers, nurtures the kids. I do more cleaning than she does, but I have the microphone, so I get to say that. It's really hard. This is my second big startup. Startups are a lot of fun because you feel this incredible sense of purpose and commitment and involvement that you sometimes don't have in other places. And it can if you let it, it will absolutely consume you. There's always something to do. It's always really pressing. It's always really really hard. At my last company, I think I definitely let it take too much of me, especially after we had our twins. They went through the NICU. I hated that, and I definitely buried myself in my work. I know to some degree to kind of escape it, and actually, because we're in a church, I'll tell a little story. It was like during like a really just tough period where I was working a lot, and the kids were difficult because they're kids, and there's two of them at the same time, and we have no idea what we're doing. And we went to what we call a lifestyle store in San Francisco. It's these stores that are like, they sell a belt buckle and a shoe and a hat, and everything is very expensive. And I ran into this guy while I was there whose name turned out to be Matt. And he surfed a lot, and I surfed a lot as well. He had a dog named Luna. We have a dog named Luna. And he also had twins. And we had twins. And it was like, oh my gosh. And I was still kind of like not exactly listening. I was still kind of just, in my weird zone at that time. And then he went on to tell this amazing story that was also a very sad story about how he became so consumed in, that he and his wife put so much time into their jobs and into their kids that there was nothing left for each other. And they ended up, divorced. And, which was a really powerful story. And I thought, man, if you've ever wanted a sign or some sort of intervention, I mean, you really are going to have to be blind if you're not going to follow this one a little bit. So for me, that was a really powerful moment, and that was like one of those moments to remember to really kind of balance the two and find time for yourself. And especially in startup life, like a lot of the stories are true. I think I worked 18 months and took 6 days off at my last company. But part of why it's worth it is because when you do really, really cool things, you want to justify it or you want to know it's worth it. And my daughter made this little art drawing during your sermon last Sunday. Apparently it wasn't very...
Apparently not.
But she wrote on here, we have to help our Earth, but if we don't do something, we're going to have to face it. Which is pretty amazing for a 6-year-old. And,
yeah.
And your sermon was okay, but this was pretty cool. And so I don't have it figured out when it comes to work-life balance. I'm striving to do better, and I think I am generally, but stuff like that helps keep you going. It helps remind you to take time away from work, but it also is fuel for doing like really cool, hard stuff as well.
Now, we're not going to keep you too long afterwards, because after this, you're taking your wife out because you've already paid for a sitter.
That's right.
Right?
Sunk cost.
Okay. All right, back to rockets. What's in rocket fuel?
So rocket fuel can take lots of forms. Ours takes the form of a kind of a mineral spirit. It's like kerosene and liquid oxygen, or LOX. That's the cool thing about space. You get to say things like LOX and slick and all sorts of fun things. So ours is a combustion of liquid oxygen and this kerosene substance. And what you're trying to do is basically give the vehicle a lot of momentum. It's kind of like, if you've ever been on a jet ski or something like that, when you turn the jet ski, the stream sprays in different directions. That's the same kind of concept with the rocket. Is you're spraying your exhaust in a certain direction. That's what steers the vehicle.
How do you light that stuff on fire?
That's what we do with the interns. Actually, I can't tell you exactly how we do it because of something called the International Traffic and Arms Regulations, but I can tell you that the lighting of the engines and getting it going is a very, very tricky part of the engineering and the operation.
Because you don't want to blow the whole thing up.
Yeah, you have to do it really carefully, because if there's too much, fuel and kind of combust and your oxidizer, your LOX, and then you light it, you can have an explosion. If there's not enough, there's nothing to light. So you have to have this, in between.
All right.
Again, it's the engineering team. My job is to make sure that they have a spaceport and that they're legally licensed and the FAA is blessed with the experience.
Okay, I have a lot of questions about explosives.
Sure.
But because we're being recorded, I'm not going to ask all of them.
Fair.
All right, so changing topics completely. Back in the 2nd century, one of my heroes, Saint Irenaeus, who was from what's now Turkey, coined the cliche that is my favorite characterization of spirituality, which is that the glory of God is a human being fully alive. Using that lens, I'm wondering if you can frame your own life and your career and answer what about all this makes you feel fully alive or more the person you were created to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think by default, to some degree, my parents are, they're from the Midwest and they're Catholics and they're from, big families and all of that. And, if you've been around that culture, not unique to it, but certainly part of that, this idea of doing good or doing works is really, really important. And for me, that was something I always kind of mixed together with my own faith, but also, I've never seen the idea of faith and works as like inseparable. Like your actions and your faith should inform each other and support each other. Has always been the thing I've most subscribed to. And then when it comes to a job and or a role in a company, I've always wanted those things to be combined as much as possible. Is this idea of doing something that's really cool, but also is really purposeful at the same time. I didn't want to do a day job and then do kind of my volunteering thing on the side, where I could live out my values and beliefs and so forth. So as much as possible, I've wanted those things to coexist. I think I've to some degree done that with mixed success, but when both those things are working together, that's why it can be so fun and why you can lose yourself in the work a little bit, certainly to a fault sometimes, is because you feel like you're doing something that's just that big and that important. I think one other thing that a mini passion project that's come up for me. I've been lucky that I've been in a couple of kind of senior positions at my last couple of companies, and as a result of that, I've been able to affect like company policies or how the company does things. And one area that I've been really excited about has actually been hiring practices in companies. Fairness and equity are always things that are very important to me, and an area that I feel like I could act on that was with how companies source and evaluate talent. And I know that sounds kind of maybe mundane, but I think a lot of challenges and ills in society are because of people's economic status, because of the inability or difficulty in getting jobs. And one thing you can do as a company is you can kind of do good by doing well by having better hiring practices. At my last company, we were really frustrated by our own hiring practices, so we spent a few days, downloaded a bunch of academic journal articles, and this is before like unconscious bias was on LinkedIn and stuff, and we were just blown away by what we learned about how hiring really works and how bias really crept into all these different things. And so many of the solutions were discovered by sociologists and scholars and stuff over the past several decades, but no one seems to actually act on it when it comes to hiring practices in companies or organizations. People kind of ignore it, which is always so weird because companies always say it's also the most important thing is people. So at my last company, we really internalized that and just overhauled completely how hiring should work and how we evaluate and source talent. And the cool thing is the company wins. You find better people, you find the best people, and I think society can some extent win because you elevate people that may not otherwise have had a chance because of their gender orientation or their height or the way they did handwriting, which used to be a way that people used to evaluate talent. So I think it's been kind of fun to be able to, of who I am, I've been able to bring that sense of fairness and equity into some of my roles, and I've been really excited to see some of the results. At my last company, 37% of our STEM roles were women, which is just phenomenally higher than the average. And it wasn't because we were targeting women, it was because we tried to create opportunities for women to be at an equal footing and not be evaluated on superficial things.
That was really cool. Yeah. Thank you. All right, one more rocket question, and then
Please.
I want to go to questions from all these people. How fast does a rocket go?
Thousands of kilometers an hour. I really feel like I should know the answer to this one. It's in the thousands of kilometers an hour. But it starts off at 0. And the craziest part is when you have liftoff and they make this, if you ever watch any YouTube videos of Astra.
Which you have on your website.
Yeah, you can check them out. And there's some good ones and some not so good ones online. So they're all fun to watch. But as soon as the vehicle moves, they have this, somebody calls out first motion. And it is amazing to see this thing that's not supposed to be moving. All of a sudden, it just imperceptibly starts to overcome gravity. And it starts slowly competing, with just the gravity pulling it down. And it slowly starts to move away from the launch pad, and suddenly it's airborne. And it is one of the most amazing things to see in person, because it shouldn't happen that way. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. And then if you find yourself in Florida, as I did 2 launches ago, you start yelling and screaming at the thing and telling it to go, 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 go. Because your job might be quite literally riding on whether that thing gets into space or not. It's a really, really exciting experience. It's hard to compete with that. I think of all the jobs I've had, I can't top that, like those rocket moments.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. But parenthood is close, right?
Parenthood's far harder. There are definitely rocket, there's rocket analogies in there. Things blow up, things go sideways, things come down.
It's expensive.
Very expensive, all sorts of stuff. But there's no regulators when it comes to parenting, which still baffles me a little bit.
Yeah, no licensing.
Yeah.
All right, on that note, Galen, could you help us coordinate traffic for people who have better informed questions than mine for Matt Ganser from Astra?
Sure. I don't know what that entails, but that's never stopped me from doing something before. So I think I don't want to. I'm afraid.
If you have a question about rockets, raise your hand. If you have a question about theology, raise both your hands, and then we can discriminate between the two.
Are we a small, tight enough group that people, and are you okay to actually come up to the microphone if you have a question? And I'll even start. I'm the first question. Hi, Matt. Thank you for coming.
Of course.
I have a question about what sci-fi movie or novel or series maybe are your favorites and have informed your work?
Yeah.
That was way nerdier than any of my questions.
I think one of the earliest books that I absolutely loved was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And it's because it was, science and engineering, but also there's this huge human component, which is, what a lot of the book is about. And there's this sense of purpose to it. Obviously it has a dark veil to it, but that was the book that always kind of got me excited about, engineering and that sort of thing. I also really liked the fact that they smoked seaweed cigars in the book. I've never smoked a seaweed cigar. I don't really smoke cigars, but if I ever have the chance, I'm definitely doing it.
All right, other questions about cigars?
Yeah, come on up, everybody.
This is not about cigars. David Boone. I actually have 2 questions, if you don't mind. First of all, what does it cost to send a satellite into space? And 2, with 5,000 going on 50,000 satellites in orbit at one time, are they not going to crash into each other, or is there an air traffic control for satellites?
Yeah, great question. So on the first one of the cost, this is one of the things I think SpaceX really blew open for everybody, which is really exciting. They've dropped the price point to thousands of dollars per kilogram. Kilogram's about a little over a couple of pounds.
2.2.
2.2, yeah. they're really starting to help commoditize that price point in a way that's really never been done before. In the past, it's always been very bespoke and very per mission focus. Now it's getting to the point where if you build a satellite, you could source it around and see what you can get for the best price point. And as the industry becomes more commoditized, as standards become more the norm, you're really going to be able just to kind of shop for the best price, which is just totally different than how it's ever been done in the past. The satellites themselves can cost from the low millions to the billions, depending on how complex it is. But I think what's really cool is that it is getting to the point where you can build satellites for cheaper than that even. I actually have a friend in town here who's building satellite thrusters in his garage for fun on the side. That's where the industry is going right now. To your second question on space debris, so this is an active question and challenge, I think, for the industry. And I think what is great about it, though, is it's going to affect everybody. And so unlike, in a very direct way, unlike, say, climate change, which might be too ephemeral or indirect for people to necessarily feel the cost or the pain of it, I think space debris is something everyone's going to get on board with a little sooner. Excuse me. Astra, we applaud some of the things that the satellite industry is doing or talking about doing, like providing transparency around health of the satellites, requiring, making sure there's deorbit plans as standard, which the FCC already requires, or is now definitely requiring, making sure that that satellites have a way of kind of understanding the health of them, and if they're unlikely to be able to last a lot longer, that they begin deorbiting sooner so that they can burn up in the atmosphere. Other kind of bits about this, it's not an unknown problem that people are ignoring. The White House just released a statement on this, which we applaud as well. The Department of Commerce is going to increasingly be the entity that monitors space debris. They've just appointed a new director who's going to be overseeing that space situational awareness, which is exciting. I think the industry as a whole is aware that this is something that has to be improved. Otherwise, it's even though space is enormous, it is somewhat of a finite resource. So we have a chance, I think, to really affect it in a way that's more sustainable from the beginning, unlike other industries in the past. Thanks for the questions.
Sort of like David, I'm concerned about the trajectories and the orbits, just like I am when I fly an airplane. Do I fly at 33,000 feet and the little ones have to stay below me? Does a bigger rocket get me further into space? Is that the military ones? And do we have any control over other countries and their trajectories too?
So currently, the military tracks all orbits. So before we launch something, we have to get clearance for the trajectory of the rocket, and we have to get clearance for the orbit of the satellite. We actually, on one of our last launches, we had to delay the launch to make sure that this International Space Station wasn't going to be in the way. So it's fairly well regulated from that perspective at this point. I think one of the things that's going to be interesting in the future is the co-location of planes and rockets sharing the same atmosphere. The future is likely going to feature a lot more rocket launches from more spaceports around the world. Rocket launches are, right now they're treated very much with large velvet gloves, and what that means is you have to clear a lot of airspace for a rocket to go up. And the idea is that you don't want to hit planes. Thankfully, that system is pretty well understood, but I think this is going to be a growing area of concern for the FAA is how do you balance people wanting, doing business trips and going on vacation and stuff like that, and companies wanting to get their payloads into orbit at a high clip. Right now, the FAA is decidedly, pro air travel, but I think if we're really going to open up space for everybody and we're really going to make it this much larger, exciting economy, there's going to have to be a little give to the space side as well. So this is definitely going to be, I think, an exciting area of regulation in the future.
That is a sentence that has never been uttered. An exciting area of regulation.
Important one, nonetheless.
Hey, Matt. Thank you for being here. This is real interesting stuff. I have a couple of questions, so I'm happy to come back up if that makes it easier for people. So I guess my first one is, as you'd said, the launch industry has really been dominated by government contracts, and when I think of government contracts in the launch industry, I am primarily thinking actually of military contracts. Like the Air Force spending on space, I think, is larger than NASA's entire budget historically. So I'm curious, in terms of your perspective, on at what point is a company like Astra going to be in a position where nearly all their contracts are coming from commercial business, as opposed to, and they don't have a like anchor dependency on either government or military contracts? You see that happening within the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or are there just sort of fundamentals that would require a shift in the kinds of demand to make that happen? And if you see that shift coming, what are the economic activities that you see driving that?
Yeah. So already about 90% of the launches and the payloads from the Cape Canaveral last year were commercial. They're not military, they're not government. That shift has already happened pretty decidedly. When we forecast forward, we still expect we're going to be launching some NASA and NOAA and other satellites, but it's going to be dominated principally by the commercial side of things. And any sort of forecast you read about, what does the architecture of space look like in the future? What are the sources of the satellites? It's dominated by private, and a lot of that is through things like Starlink or Amazon Kuiper, these big communication networks, or Planet here in town, or San Francisco with hundreds of satellites in low Earth orbit. I think the militarization of space will be a thing that continues. You do see that in the budgets, the amount of money being spent. I think the Ukrainian crisis really puts a fine point on that. That is certainly going to be continue to be a theater that the military operates in. But when we look at our own forecast and where it's going to be principally private commercial that's going to be really pushing it forward.
Does this include the Jewish space lasers that one member of Congress discussed?
I'm not familiar, but all right, I'm going to dig into that. That seems
I'm interested in knowing what's the value for a rocket company to be in Alameda, and why is it, what's good and what's not good?
Yeah, great question. So Astra, we got started in 2016. We came to Alameda in about 2018, so several years ago, and we were principally drawn by the engine test cells on the Alameda at the old Naval Air Station. So for those of you not from here, the northern third of the island is an old naval air base. Tons of abandoned structures and all sorts of stuff there. And one of the things that's really cool is you have these buildings with walls that are several feet thick that were designed for testing jet engines, fighter jet engines, stuff like that. And that was the initial reason that we came here. Is it's very unique to be able to do that in an urban environment. What's kept us here is that there are some really cool buildings, large buildings on the base that you can do stuff in. So right now we're not just a company of we're not just the keyboard economy. We do have technology folks and engineering folks and overhead like me, but we also have a lot of manufacturing. So we manufacture all of our vehicles here. We build everything here. About 30% of our workforce is what you would call blue collar, which is pretty amazing to be creating manufacturing jobs in the Bay Area when most companies are doing their best to get that out of California because it is difficult to do business here. There continues to be, I think, a lot of opportunity for Astra to remain in Alameda. So we continue to be really engaged with the city council and the city at large to see what that future could look like.
Hi. As someone who works with satellites, and I just know that a lot of people have like a very like a large attachment to the satellites that they're making, and a lot of times it's like years and years of work, even generations of people, and I could imagine that then they hand it to you, and that's quite a lot of pressure. How does your company cope with dealing with, or with like having to send up their baby, and how do you personally cope with that, with the pressure?
We are a customer-driven company. We are not a, we're not a jobs program. We're not a, an R&D facility. We're there to serve our customers. It's a private business, and so we try to treat our customers first and foremost in all the decisions that we make. That is the only way that we're going to be successful in this really competitive industry. Our customers come first when it comes to schedule. We invite them in. They get to see the entire factory. They get to go see all the qualification and acceptance testing that we go through. We feel that responsibility, and we try to be as open as we can and transparent with all of our systems and processes to make sure they know exactly what they're getting into. It is a really cool act of trust or even faith, and sometimes it doesn't work, and you really feel that. On launch day, I think that is built in just the overall apprehension that everyone feels like you're in it together. It's not just about the rocket, it's also the payload. I don't know what goes through everybody's head, but for me it's a mixture of anxiety, excitement, terror, happiness when it works. It's a really pretty amazing experience. Those 5 to 8 minutes help make up for some pretty long nights and weekends. I am excited for the point where, Astra, for example, where we are routinely launching satellites with, very, very few issues, similar to SpaceX. I think what's really neat, though, increasingly about the way the satellite industry is going, is that a lot of these satellites are becoming fairly cheap and affordable to build, and people can turn them out pretty quickly. The panacea that some companies and people are talking about is that you can build a satellite within weeks or months and then launch it, which is just a paradigm shift from when it was like generations of people that touched a satellite. That's been 20 years in the making. When we get to that point, what's going to be kind of cool is when all that's commoditized, the relative value and hopefully emotional heritage that goes with some of these payloads diminishes a little bit.
Matt, while Maggie's coming up, is there an insurance market for the owners of the satellites? If you don't get into orbit, what happens? Who pays?
It's a great question. Generally, it's possible to insure the payloads. I don't know actually from our customer set who's done that and who hasn't. So interesting question. I'll take one down. We do have launch insurance though.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
My question was a follow-up about who are your competitors, both in the United States and internationally?
Yeah, so it's a pretty new industry. We're like in a third renaissance of space. It's kind of like we're at the beginning of the internet and we're not exactly sure where it's going to go. So it's a really exciting time. As far as the number of launch providers, the number one that everybody knows is, aware of is SpaceX, and they certainly were the company that really opened it up. As far as the companies that, the rest of us that are, following in various ways and hopefully, will compete and surpass them in some ways, companies like Rocket Lab, Astra, Relativity, ABL, Virgin Orbit. What we think makes us different is we're trying to really commoditize it. We're trying to bring a lot of mass manufacturing techniques to rockets, which traditionally have been built like a Corvette or a Lamborghini. We're trying to make like a Civic. Nothing wrong with a Civic. Civics are great. That's much nicer than my first car. But rockets have always been these very, very bespoke, expensive things, and we're trying to go the opposite direction. A lot of our engineers and folks come from Tesla and or Apple, places where you mass manufacture really delicate parts. So they're trying to bring those same techniques and to really help drive the price point that we can ultimately pass forward to the customer in terms of value. I think what's cool about Astra is so not only the kind of the price point, but that ability to be the FedEx of space that I was talking about before, because we're not going to have as large of payloads, we'll be able to get to where our customers want to go kind of on demand in a way that's going to be really hard for a company like SpaceX to do. We'll be able to serve a lot of unique orbits and kind of replenishment and so forth because of it. The other thing that's kind of cool about something like Astra, SpaceX's facilities are massive, as you might expect, at Cape Canaveral. They're very expensive, involved infrastructure projects that require a lot of environmental reviews and so forth. Astra's launch system tends to be much smaller and much simpler. It's a few trailers, a launch stool, the rocket, and that's about it. In fact, our entire launch system fits in 6 or 7 shipping containers, and it takes 6 people to set it up and launch a rocket. I think it's harder to go Boy Scout camping than it is to, to launch an Astra vehicle. So there's definitely competition, and it's probably going to be frothy for a few years. We're hoping, obviously, to be one of the companies that really differentiates and capitalizes on kind of where the space is going. And we think the way we've designed our vehicle, with the idea of mass manufacturing and the very light footprint is really going to help differentiate ourselves.
So fascinating stuff. I'm not super familiar with this industry, but I am kind of curious. You talk about going from 1,000 satellites to like tens of thousands or more. Where's that demand coming from, and what exactly are those satellites doing? Like, could you break that down by like categories, and what proportion are doing this versus that?
Yeah, so as far as kind of the general categories, communication is going to be a big one. So your phone. Think of Wi-Fi from the sky everywhere. Think autonomous driving, that everything is going to be connected everywhere. That's a huge driver of it. Earth observation, like I was sharing earlier, a company like Planet, where they're imaging every piece of every centimeter of the Earth at a really high revisit rate, where they're able to take that information, that data, and share it and use it in lots of different ways. That's another big category. Remote sensing, so the NASA Tropics missions I was talking about earlier, what they're doing is they're observing humidity, temperature, and 8 other channels that I forgot the professor was saying, telling us about actually earlier today. Our customer was actually visiting our factory day, which was pretty exciting. But they're monitoring all these physical parameters from hundreds of kilometers away to better understand how hurricanes are formed and that sort of thing. Those are some of the big categories, and like the applications are, it could be autonomous vehicle, it could be renewable energy system, it could be understanding how the planet works, but a lot of it we expect to be in the communications realm. Think like, an airplane's go-go or something like that. That's another application for something like this, and we think there's, obviously more interesting and kind of better ways of doing stuff like that.
So I have a friend who is like employee number 7 at Spire and used to tell me all these stories about how they would actually send some of their satellites into space with their names etched on it, or they would send letters to space. And I was wondering if you guys have had the opportunity to launch anything into space, like with your name physically written on it, something, it's just something, a fun question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's another cool company, Spire. If it costs weight, probably not. Weight is very precious on a rocket. What we have done, though, is on our vehicles and on our launcher, we usually put some sort of message, to kind of broadcast our brand and what we care about a little bit. I think on one of our last vehicles, we actually had "From Alameda with Love" written on the side. That's kind of that's the extent of the fun, because otherwise we name our vehicles like LV-06, LV-07, LV-08. I think just one thing that kind of jumped in my head from the last question. I think one thing that was really interesting that I read about recently, the Pew Research Center did a study or survey of Americans to ask what they thought the top priority of NASA should be. The top one on the list was understanding Earth's climate and climate systems and that sort of thing. The bottom two things were going to Mars and going to the moon, which, if you're really into sci-fi, that might be really upsetting to hear, but I think it does reflect a lot of where business and a lot of where business thinks that the industry is going, is that services should be pointed at the planet and improving what people's day-to-day living.
I think we have time for a couple more questions still, yeah?
We do.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear it. I know that there's a Hannah, and then, Hannah, you'll be next. No, you are the one. And you're next, and I know you had another question.
So, hi, lots of people asked my questions already, but I have another one.
Please.
So you're trying to commoditize your rockets. Is there any goal to make them reusable? Or is that not part of your strategy? And what is the sustainability impact of your business?
Sure. So right now, our vehicles are made of aluminum. It's not very much aluminum. It falls in the ocean, and then it corrodes over probably a few decades. Imperfect, yes, but relative to the amount of shipping containers lost, it's a far smaller fraction as far as material and so forth going. And as an engineer, and I helped start a clean tech company that was called Carbon Lighthouse, focused on climate change. There's always a balance of, what is the relative good and bad of something, or the pros and cons. For me, looking at Astra, being able to launch satellites like the Tropics missions that could help us understand how cyclones, how to model those and understand those is certainly worth the CO2 it takes to get them up there. Like cyclones, it's like $15 trillion worth of damage, hundreds of thousands of people who have died, over the past decades. In the scheme of things, it's well worth the carbon footprint from that degree. As a business, maybe we'll start with a rocket. Our rockets are pretty basic at the end of the day. If you guys ever come for a tour, which we hold tours, the rockets are made of aluminum mostly, which is pretty basic stuff. And a few other materials I probably shouldn't name, but it's things you'd find are kind of in any sort of workshop. So no nasty kind of chemicals for the most part. Our propellants are liquid oxygen and kerosene, which if you read up about all the different exotic varieties of rocket propellants, you can get much nastier than that. There's some stuff that literally catches fire as soon as it's exposed to oxygen. It's and then there's a lot of other stuff that's very carcinogenic. So I wouldn't say we have green fuels, but I think we have pretty innocuous fuels in the spectrum of what's possible. And that's by design. It makes it a lot safer and easier to operate, and ultimately, we think cheaper. Astra as a business, I think we've spent a lot of time trying to incentivize alternative forms of transportation. So one thing I'm excited to share is we have about 27% of our workforce doesn't use single occupancy vehicles, bikes, buses, even 1% of our employees walk, ferry. Those are really big for the company. By virtue of Alameda Municipal Power, we're 100% renewables, which is cool, which saved the need to install a bunch of panels on the roof, which was pretty great. And I think one thing that's really neat about Astra, and really a lot of the companies at Alameda Point, is that you have all these massive buildings that were built by the Navy back in the day. And especially in my last industry, when I worked in the built environment, so many people are obsessed with, we need to knock down buildings and then we'll build better buildings in their place. The embedded carbon footprint, the embedded CO2 in steel and concrete is enormous. And one of the best things you can do is not knock down buildings, but reuse them and adapt them to new purposes. And that's one of the things that Astra is doing at the point, is we're taking these aging buildings full of asbestos and lead and all sorts of nasty stuff, cleaning them up and then reusing them. And there's a lot of buildings, at the point. There's a lot of, opportunities at the point. I hear the mayor is coming in a few weeks. I suggest maybe asking her a little bit about how we can incentivize and make some of that stuff happen faster.
Matt, I have a question coming in from Lucy Helms, who's a college student at Smith College, who graduated from this church. So this is another question about pollution. She's wondering about light pollution with all these satellites scattered out there. How does that affect astronomers?
Ooh, this is a great question, and I don't know the answer to it exactly. I know that Starlink, which is owned by SpaceX, and Starlink's competitor are starting to get into a little bit of I don't know if a legal battle, but it's some sort of battle with each other about what to do with the proliferation of Starlink satellites, of which there's going to be thousands likely.
Wait, you're saying Elon Musk is inserting himself into the world in unexpected and irritating ways?
Yes. I'll leave it there. So I think this kind of goes into, I think the answer to this is really working through industry trade groups about pushing for standards around making sure that you're minimizing reflection, making sure that you're accounting for the reflectivity of your kit in orbit, making sure that when it comes to things that are aging or about to expire, that you make sure that there's a deorbit plan in place and it actually gets followed through. So those are some of the things that we would like to see the industry, satellite industry as a whole, really lead on, in order to make sure that space continues to be a place for everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's sort of our vision for the church, but not in space. Everyone is welcome.
Did you have a question, Hannah? Are you going to be our last one? Are you sure?
Galen, we've got time for about one more short one, I think.
Yeah. And by the way, Marilyn, if you listen to this, I was smiling when I said we should ask you about it, but.
No, you're the one. You're the last one, so.
Since the mayor is coming by and you were talking about Alameda Point and the stuff y'all are doing there, if you could encourage one other type of company or to locate in Alameda Point to sort of grow your business and your industry, what kind of company would it be?
I think one thing that, there's a lot of interesting companies out there, but I think one thing that is really unique and cool about Alameda Point is that you have companies like McHale, companies like Saildrone, companies like Astra, Power Engineering, Rightspeed. You have companies that are manufacturing stuff and building stuff, and what would be sad is if we pushed those companies out because of either zoning concerns or use permit concerns or whatnot. I'm not anti, tech at all, having just helped build a tech company for a long time. But I think having a diversity of skill sets and jobs in a community is something that's kind of unique. And I think Alameda Point can be a hub for that. We have an awful lot of really big industrial space out there, and I would like to see that preserved for a lot of those needs. I think Alameda Point could be this amazing mixed use area of residential, commercial, and industry in concert with each other. And so whatever comes, I would love it to kind of continue this vein of really cool high-tech manufacturing. I think Astra has experienced, a really big reason that Astra has been successful and we've been able to push through the pandemic the way we have is because we've had that ability, we've had that in-house. And it would be great for more companies to kind of see that as a special sauce to really differentiate themselves and really succeed compared to their competitors.
All right. Folks, we are at the end of an hour here. And before we close up, I do want to advertise in 3 weeks' time, the mayor of Alameda, Marilyn Ezzy Ashcraft, will be here answering questions about our community life that we all share. So please come on back for that if you are able. I really want to learn about a tour because I want to bring my kids out there, a tour of Astra. So Thank you for mentioning. I'm going to follow up with you about that. But for our purposes tonight, I first want to just thank you, Matt, for taking the time to answer all our questions and share some of this amazing stuff that you guys are doing out there.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
And with that, I think you owe your wife a good date.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, very much for coming out. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Galen Parsons, Will Scott, who's away, and Hannah Hurley, who have all worked hard to pull this together. Oh, yes, and on the camera and on social media and on lots of promotion, Rachel McCoskey back there, too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Didn't know what time it was, the lights were low. Oh, oh. I leaned back on my radio. Oh, oh. Some cat was laying down some rock and roll, not a soul, he said. Then the loud sound, it seemed to fade. Came back like a slow voice on a wave of fade. That weren't no DJ, that was hazy cosmic jive. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He's told us not to blow it, 'cause he knows it's all worthwhile. is a star.